Hello, everybody. Welcome to the special business meeting for the District of Squamish for Tuesday, February 18th. Holland Squallen, Clis Tukmut, Klas Squamish Okmeo. As always, we're gathered to do our work today on the traditional unceded territory of the Squamish Nation. Please be advised this council meeting is being live streamed, recorded, and will be available to the public to view on the District of Squamish website following the meeting. If you have concerns, please notify the corporate officer present at the meeting. Could I have someone move adoption of the agenda, please? Moved by Councillor Stoner, second by Councillor Hamilton. All in favor? Motion carries. Thank you. We're on to item 3.1, which is a staff report. So 2025 non-market change and WLNG class 4 major industry change and tax rate calculation methodology and policy direction. I will pass it over to your staff to run us through the presentation.
Great. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. My name is Laura Turner, Director of Financial Planning and Reporting, and I'm joined by Heather Boxford, General Manager of Financial IT and Procurement Services. We're here with you today to receive direction from Council on the preferred tax rate calculation methodology, which will be used in the calculation of the 2025 tax rates and form the basis of a draft tax policy. We'll also present the preliminary 2025 non-market change and the associated increase in tax revenue from WLNG. The staff recommendation before you today is that Council directs staff to calculate the 2025 mill rates for inclusion in the tax rate bylaw utilizing a chosen tax rate calculation methodology. Direct staff to draft a tax policy utilizing the same chosen tax rate calculation methodology. Receive for information the preliminary non-market change results provided in the December 31st tax roll, and direct staff to proceed with an amendment to the 2025 to 2029 financial plan bylaw to increase the tax revenue received from class 4 major industry and transfer the revenue to a reserve. So under section 197 of the community charter, the district must by bylaw establish property tax rates before May 15th of the same year. In 2024, Council requested that the tax rate calculation methodology be reviewed and a tax policy be brought back to Council for consideration. So to establish municipal tax rates, there are two defining steps. First, determining the annual tax revenue requirement, which is done through adoption of the 5-year financial plan. And second, determine how much each property class should contribute based on a tax rate calculation. There's several methods to calculate municipal tax rates, but two common examples are the fixed tax ratio and the revenue distribution method. The fixed tax rate ratio method, which is currently used by the district, calculates tax rates based on a previously established ratio, which are kept consistent year over year. Ratios represent tax rates for all classes relative to the residential class as one, and therefore modifying the ratios would change the distribution of the tax burden. Under this method, rates are mathematically calculated to generate the total tax revenue required in the approved financial plan while maintaining the pre-established tax rate ratios. These include the business and managed forest land at 2.5 to 2.8 times residential, and recreation, nonprofit, and farm with a ratio of 1 or equal to residential. The rates must also be adjusted for provincially legislated tax rate caps while still maintaining the ratios, and these include utilities of class 2, which are capped at 40, port class 4 capped at 27.5, and port improvements, which are capped at 22.5. Once the new rates are established, they are applied to the current year's assessments and non-market change to result in the final taxation revenues. Under this methodology, Council may set and revise tax rate ratios through policy to redistribute the tax burden across the classes. Under the revenue distribution method, prior year's tax revenue distribution by class, otherwise known as the tax base before NMC, is used as the starting point. Tax rates are then mathematically calculated to generate the taxation revenue in the approved financial plan while maintaining the same revenue distribution. Similar to the tax rate ratio method, the rates must also be adjusted for the provincially legislated tax rate caps, which we will redistribute the tax revenue requirement for utilities, which is capped at 40, port, again capped at 27.5, and port improvements capped at 22.5. And then once these new rates have been established, they're applied to the current year's assessment and non-market change to result in the final taxation revenue distribution. Presented here is a comparison of the 2024 municipal tax rate, tax ratio, and revenue distribution percentages using the two methodologies. Notable differences include higher tax rate, tax ratio, and revenue distribution for the light industry and business under the tax ratio method, and higher tax revenue distribution on residential properties under the revenue distribution method. For the 2025 tax year, BC Assessment has provided preliminary property assessments as of December 31st, 2024, as presented on this slide. Although assessments will change prior to the final roll in March, staff wanted to highlight that preliminary assessed NMC is 1.64%. This is mainly due to the reclass of the WLNG to Class 4 major industry. Using preliminary tax rates for 2025, this translates into an increase in revenue of approximately 1.9 million, or 4.5%, using the tax rate ratio method, and 1.8 million, or 4.4%, using the revenue distribution method. So before moving on to WLNG, I'll pause here and turn it back to Mayor and Council for discussion on the tax distribution policy, noting the 3 recommendations in the report.
Thank you for the presentation. Questions, Council? Councillor Hamilton?
Thanks very much for the presentation, and thank you for going and bringing this back to Council. A question about the fixed rate method that it wasn't clear to me until looking into it, and I just want to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. It treats market change and non-market change identically. Is that correct? So there's no distinction when we use the fixed ratio method to propagate from one year to the next. The non-market changed, we don't actually need that number to do the propagation. It's only a back calculation for how much change was from non-market.
Great, through the chair. So it will be distributed based on the ratio that then sort of guides the rate. So as the rates all increase, it'll take the assessed value for the base and non-market change, and then based on the rate that's been reallocated to meet the ratio, it'll then calculate it out that way to produce the total revenue. So they are treated similarly.
Okay. Okay, so when I apply the fixed ratio method and reproduce the numbers that we've done for 2022, 2023, and 2024, I can do that without using the non-market change for the sector by sector non-market change numbers. So to me, that means we don't use the sector by sector non-market change numbers in the fixed ratio method. I understand we sort of back calculate how much revenue would have been coming from the non-market change, but we don't use those numbers to calculate the new mill rates. Do I understand that correctly?
So through the chair, it's essentially the starting point would be last year's base, and then increasing the rates to then maintain that ratio to get to the targeted revenue, which is in your financial plan. So then those rates would then calculate based on the base and the non-market change to get you to your total revenue. So your target is your financial plan number, yeah.
And so a change, yeah, thanks. So a change due to the base and a change due to the non-market change have the same impact. So effectively, they look the same to the sector. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. Go ahead, Councillor Stoner.
Thank you, through the chair. I'm just wondering if staff can clarify what the role or the impact of non-market changes to the tax burden under the two different methodologies, like by class. So if we have, for example, a large increase in non-market change one year that is predominantly attributed to a single class, would the tax burden for that class increase or decrease relative to the non-market change under the different methodologies? Or does that not matter?
So through the chair, starting with the revenue distribution model, the NMC would stay within that class. So the assessed NMC times the rate, that would produce your NMC revenue, and that would stay within it, increasing the tax burden of just that class or the revenue requirement. In the tax rate ratio method, because it is spread out a little bit to make sure that the ratios are maintained, there still will be an increase in the NMC revenue, and that would stay within those classes. So that would increase the tax burden of where that NMC was distributed to.
But the NMC in the fixed ratio methodology is transferred across all the classes as opposed to individually. So if we have growth, so non-market change is a reflection of growth in that category. So if we had all of a sudden a whole bunch of new light industry, for that tax class to absorb, because you have more taxpayers in that tax class, technically you'd want the non-market change to stay within that tax class, right? Because there's more people paying in that tax class.
Through the chair, you're following correctly, but the idea of where NMC should be is a political statement. So we can't weigh in one way or another on that.
That's fair. I just wanted to make sure that my math was correct. So thank you for outlining where the political component lies. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go around just to see if there's any other questions that haven't gone yet. Councillor Pettingill in French.
Yeah, just I've been thinking of this in a slightly different way. So just to make sure I'm on the same pages, in the fixed ratio method that we've been doing, essentially non-market change is shared, the benefit of it is shared proportional to the ratios. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's correct. So it would be distributed in the same ratio that the rate is calculated as well on those caps.
Right. Okay. Thank you. The other thing then, I just want to understand a little more clearly the distinction between non-market change versus market change. I had been thinking it was strictly a question of, is it a new tax roll? But some of the conversation on wood fiber, and I guess we'll get into this a bit more, makes me think, because I thought those were already a bunch of class 4 properties that just hadn't had improvements yet, so they had low value, so you weren't seeing any money. And so to my mind, that would be considered market change, but it seems like something. So what is the technical difference between market and non-market?
Thank you for the question, through the chair. There's a number of things that can qualify as non-market change. So non-market change can be a reclass. So from moving from one class to another, it can be new folios onboarded into the community. And then there's a number of other elements that are, if there was a significant change in the use of the property, that might be something that stays within the class, but might consider it a non-market change. That is completely governed by the Assessment Act under, and in the role of BC Assessments. Assessed value is purely the folios that are there and their value in the market, so to speak. So if the house goes up from $1 million to 1.2 million, the assessed value is just simply that, but it would have no impact on non-market change. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, I just want to recognize that we're going to the wood fiber piece next. And I just want to make sure you keep your questions to the pieces that are pertinent to the first three questions we're being asked to, if you can.
Yeah, thanks. And that was just a sort of understanding where the non-market. So if I had a residential property then, and I'm not creating new property, but I put in a carriage house and turn my singleplex into a duplex, is that non-market change or is that market change, or is it depends, and someone would make that call?
That would depend. That is the nuance in which we have fully given the authority to BC Assessments.
Okay. And I'll go to Councillor French.
Thanks, Mayor. On Friday, Council was provided with a spreadsheet that had the non-market change data that dates back to 2015. And the spreadsheet is indicating the 2024 non-market change was 2.51%. So I went back to last year, found a report to Council from April 16th that indicated that the non-market change was 3.3%. So I'm looking for some idea of how that discrepancy between reporting then and reporting now changes.
Through the chair. So the original number that you were seeing, the 2.5 NMC, that would be the assessed NMC. So that would be the actual assessed value increase. But then the 3.3% would be the revenue on that. So to sort of translate from the assessed value to the 3.3%, we would take the NMC assessed value times the tax rates in those classes, and that would generate the total revenue, which would be the 3.3% increase.
Okay. In sharing this with Councillor Stoner, she suggested that one possible scenario could be a situation where the original non-market change percentage is an estimate, and then somewhere later down the road, the estimate becomes reality and they may be different. Could that potentially be a factor in shifting these percentages?
From the time when you're looking at 2024, you're looking at the final roll at that time when we're set to set the taxes. This isn't actually a change from year over year. This is a change between assessed value and tax revenue value. So nothing has changed there. There could possibly be instances where we have supplementaries, which is called a supplementary, when somebody challenges a roll that could change that base for the next year.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to, if anyone hasn't asked a question yet, I'll go back to Councillor Hamilton and then Penigo.
Thanks. And just one more, you said there was a two-step process, and I just wanted to make sure there is a third step in there, right? Because this is the process by which the mill rates are propagated by default from one year to the next. Council still looks at it and has the authority, even after this policy is set, to change them based on conditions that might be relevant in the day, correct?
Thank you for the question through the chair. Yes, that's correct. Council always has the prerogative or the option to change the direction of a policy.
Okay, thank you. And I'll go to you next, Councillor Penningelis. To me, this tax policy piece and the revenue consideration of the revenue distribution model is to support that over time. That councils is another tool to understand what's happening, another way to visualize it over time. And do we have? I appreciate the two tables, the differences between the two. Do we have into the revenue distribution method? Are there some sort of? I'm trying to find the averages, like what other communities have as far as distribution goes. I know that we have challenges with our industrial tax base just over broadly. So how do we understand that our starting point is in the right spot? I know that over time, in my time here, I think this is what our maybe sixth budget cycle, and talking about the ratios, and it's always builds one year over next. So I could see if it gets out of whack in one way, for whatever reason, challenges to correct that in one go. So how do you view this in a long term, making sure that those distribution happens appropriately over the classes? To me, there's two different there's tools here, but like how do we score that, and how do we sort of set the targets as to what's healthy there broadly, outside of council acknowledging council has discretion every year as we look at this? But how yeah, just can you speak about that a little bit, please?
Sure. Thank you for the question, through you, Mayor. What other communities have done that I've seen, and I would recommend that the district also take this, is that once a policy is set, that it's reviewed every 3 to 5 years. And in that time period, we would bring community comparisons, noting that community comparisons is challenging. Each community is different, and it's not an apples to apples always, so you'd have to be considering that. But that's what we've seen in some tax policies, that it's just sort of been reviewed in the time period. One other recommendation we make in terms of the actual policy is that if there's anything major fluctuations outside of the norm, that we would bring that back to council's attention.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about how the distribution could shift over time, and to me, it feels like a long enough term piece to almost be matched with the 5-year financial, and that over time, if the adjustments do need to be made, they need to be really made incrementally, so there's not a huge swing if we're off by where we would like to be. Correcting that in a one-off is really challenging. I can see that really. Okay, that makes sense to me. Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, thanks. So 2 things. First, just to understand Councillor French's comment, I think what you're saying is BC Assessment figured out the assessment of each property that grew by 2.5% over the previous year. Then we took that number, multiplied it by the ratios per class, which resulted in a 3.3% change in tax revenue. Is that accurate?
Through the chair. So it's actually multiplied by the rates. Yeah. Yeah.
Which are set by the ratios.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So the other, I guess, maybe this is more of a comment, but I guess the models seem useful in sort of really seeing the impact of our principles. And I think where I'm struggling is to understand is where either one or something else ends up. Is it consistent with the principles? And are we sort of in agreement on the principles, or do we need to refine the principles? And I think for me, what I see in the ratio method is that we are saying essentially non-market change, market change, and so on should impact your tax rate proportional to the ratios. And so if your property goes up a lot more than anyone else's, then you probably should pay more taxes. And if it goes down a lot, you probably should pay a lot less taxes. For me, that's a piece of moderating wild increases in land prices, among a few other things. So that makes sense to me. And I guess I'm not clear about what the other model, the option 2, achieves differently from a principle perspective, or where are my colleagues on, like, what principles or outcomes are we trying to achieve with whatever model we choose? And I think I'm comfortable with the fixed ratio method, but I'm not clear enough if the other one does something better, or if there's some misalignment on our principles. To me, it feels like that one makes sense, but I'm sort of open to hear what others have to say there.
I would welcome I do feel it's kind of a comment turned into a question. I don't know if staff has anything on that piece. I will go to seeing. Yeah, go ahead. Yes, question of clarity for Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, a question that I might help clarify. So in the revenue distribution model, when we move from one year to the next, each sector, the base of each sector, their tax increase remains the same. So the residential base, the business base, and the industrial base would all see the same tax bill increase. Whereas in the fixed ratio method, each of the tax rate increases are going to depend on what's happening in the market and non-market changes. Is that correct? And does that help to answer your question? I'm not sure.
Yeah. I'm going to go to Councillor Pettingill first.
Well, yeah, I guess when I tried to run through the numbers in the spreadsheet, I saw that in the what's it called? The distribution method, there's a divorcing, I think, of changes in assessment from changes in tax, where to my mind, those things should be coupled together. So if you see a disproportionate massive increase in your equity, your valuation, I think you should see a more significant increase in your taxation. And I think without that, for example, we get runaway land price costs, among other things. So there's some other, I think there's some fairness and wealth redistribution comments there, if that's the difference.
Yeah, I'm just going to go ask for clarity on this one particular piece. I'm going to go to staff on this one. Do either of these models isolate anyone from increase? I mean, if all the assessments go up in a category, then there's no tax increase beyond whatever tax increase the council of the day has decided, right? But if there is an increased assessment, does either of these isolate someone from that jump in assessment to others in the same category?
Through the mayor. So I think maybe there's a bit of a confusion between assessment and the NMC piece of this. So if your assessment goes up in a class, you will pay more based on the rate established. If your assessment goes up in a class based higher than your neighbor, you will pay higher than your neighbor. And if it goes down, you pay lower than your neighbor within your class. So the original question around if one methodology versus another is tracking with our principles, both would track with the principles if they're consistent year over year. So our principles are really around consistency and stability and predictability. And so that is where policy comes into place. Whether or not it's a fair distribution, that is a political statement.
Okay, Councillor Stoner.
So building off of that, Ms. Boxrood, where our current policy, and appreciate that staff is proposing to bring back a new policy based on this discussion. What we have currently set our principles for tax rate policies are based on the 2011 principles. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And at that time, I don't know if anybody can answer this, but I guess why do we use the fixed rate ratio as opposed to the revenue distribution model? Is there a reason why that is a preferred option, or is it just it has been a matter of principle, and so for consistency factor year over year, that's what we've used? What's been the driving factor behind that? Is that better aligned with the principles, or they both serve and they just have slightly different outcomes?
Through the chair. So in 2011, when the guiding principles were established, at that time, the council of that day chose to cap the business, the various ratios at between 2.5 and 2.8. That was in order to be able to keep affordability of those classes. That has been consistent year over year. In terms of aligning with those principles, again, the guiding principles is about consistency, stability, and predictability. So that would not change. So if you were to change that, as long as we do the same thing year over year, we would still, as an organization, remain within the guiding principles.
So, yeah, go ahead.
And then further to that, based on the table that it is in the staff report, under the revenue distribution method, the business ratio still stays below that anticipated 2.8%. It actually drops to 2.3. Am I reading that correct? So sorry, that's the table on page 8 of our report. So we're still achieving that same policy goal.
Through the chair. So that's correct. So it would drop. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, Council, looking at the recommendation we have here, I'm going to ask a clarifying question in that one, to me, this is like two parts. One is to develop the draft of policy going forward. Another one is what we do right now. Do we know enough about I can see us going towards the distribution model. Do we know enough about it to apply this year? Like, I know we've run some numbers. Given that we need to develop a policy, is it about the model itself, or is it really the goals that we aim to achieve with that and guidelines around that? Like, I'm just trying to see if these things, to me, there could be I could see some logic for a different answer to each of those questions, perhaps. Just I wanted to get your perspective on that.
From a staff perspective, the ability to pivot between one or the other is fine. We have those models prepped. So for 2025, that is not a problem.
Okay. And then what would be a next step on that second bullet point? Just what does that entail? Like, the draft of tax policy, would that come back to us at some point for some debate or some broader discussion around making sure we understand values and that kind of thing, that some of the things I've heard here today? Or like, what would be the process around that one, just so we understand?
Staff are looking for direction today to be able to take that direction and draft the policy. The draft policy will then come back to council for consideration. That will be sometime in 2025. It has not been scheduled on the open agenda planner at this point.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Pettingill?
I just want to clarify, when I compare sort of what is at the end of the day, the impact on someone's tax bill, in the distribution model that's proposed, the new one for us, and give or take, but essentially it applies whatever your taxes were the year before, everyone sees a 10% increase this year, regardless of class. Whereas where we're doing now, if we were to follow that methodology, the increase per class is significantly different. And to my mind, and I think this is the question, to my mind, that makes sense, because if one class saw a much more significant increase in assessment, you should see a larger, and when I say percent increase, I'm not saying this is the percent increase in taxes paid, not your tax rate. So the taxes paid for everyone across the classes relative to the year before increased 10.6%, whereas in the new methodology, in the old one, your taxes paid over the previous year increases proportional to your increase in assessed value. So if you saw a much larger increase in assessed value, essentially you're not protected from the change in your assessed value. Whereas in the new method, if your assessment doubled, you would still only pay 10% more than you did last year, which I think is a concern for me in the new methodology.
I'd like to get some clarity on this state, on these concerns. There's a bit of I don't know if there's a factual piece we can clarify here, because that doesn't match my understanding of either model. Yeah, can you help us with this one?
I'll start. So through the chair, if we're increasing the property tax rate by, let's say, 10% for all, it wouldn't directly translate into your taxes increasing by 10%. Because your starting point would be your assessed value times the rate. So someone who has a higher assessment would still pay more. And if your assessment grew significantly in that year, then the amount paid would still increase, as opposed to if your assessed value went down, it could go down as well.
Yeah, do you want to ask clarity? We're seeking clarity to make sure we have an informed decision here, so go ahead.
But I guess my understanding of the whole point of the redistribution method is that everyone sees the same increase in taxes paid. So everyone sees whatever I paid last year, I pay 10% more every sector. Okay. Whereas I think, and I guess that's part of my confusion. I guess I'm not sure why it's important to keep it in this sector, or why we would want to moderate the impact of an assessment change on your taxes. Because to me, that unleashes land value increases. Like there's nothing constraining it.
This is mainly driven by the non-market change. That's the crux of this in my mind, but it affects everything. So everyone else can define their own crux, I suppose, but go ahead.
Hey, that's another clarifying question. To me, the biggest differentiation between these two is how the non-market change is allocated and managed. Is that a fair distillation of all of this hard work?
Thank you, through the chair. That's correct.
So we're trying to determine whether for the non-market change, it means generally that you have more folios within a certain class. There's different ways that you can have non-market change. You can get a redistribution or a reclass, but typically it just means that there's more people in that class that are paying tax. And so if you keep the non-market change within that class, then those new people are what are holding that tax burden, as opposed to everybody managing the increase in the tax burden over all the classes. So you're allocating more of the tax burden to the new folks. Is that a fair assumption or distillation? And you can tell me if it's too political. That's a very fair response.
Through the chair, that's a fair assessment. Yeah, for sure.
And I think it provides a granularity to be able to understand that actually is the what you do with it from there is I think is sort of a knock on from this. But yeah, thank you for that. Councillor Hamblin.
Yeah, I think it was just a clarification point, but I think Councillor Stoner did a great job of clarifying it. But for example, if we had 1 year where there was zero market change, but one sector had an increase in non-market change, one sector had an increase in the number of folios, using the fixed ratio method, that increase in burden would be distributed across everybody. Whereas in the revenue distribution model, that increase in non-market change would stay within that sector. They would take more burden. Yeah.
So I'm just doing a time check for us, council. We're close to time. We haven't even tackled the WLNG piece yet, which has been known to be lengthy from time to time when we discuss that matter. So I'm going to go to Councillor Pettingill and I'll be looking for a motion here, please.
So clarifying question then, are we saying that if we had a year where there was zero non-market change anywhere, but there was significant market change differentiated between classes, that these two methodologies would come out to the same changes? Because if this is all about non-market change, both should give us the same end result. Whereas I don't have confidence that as when I run stuff through, it seems like there's also change due to market change that these are impacting, which separating those out, I'm not clear on. So if we said non-market change was zero, does that make these two functionally equivalent?
So through the chair, so it would be close. The difference in the tax rate ratio method would be if your target is your approved financial plan, and to get there and accommodate for the ratios being capped for some categories, there you may have to shift some of the revenue, but it would be comparable.
Go ahead, Councillor Hamilton.
I'd like to move item number 1, district staff calculate the 2025 mill rates utilizing the revenue distribution method.
And would you say the same? And I asked the question earlier and I missed this, the asterisk at the bottom of this, that must use same calculation methodology. So I apologize for that, but both together.
Put the motion for the second as well, yes.
Okay. And I'm going to suggest number 3 in there as well, because that's received the information. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. So for the first 2, and then we'll do that other one with the, okay. Thank you. So the first 2, is there a seconder for that? Second by Councillor Stoner. Comments?
Yeah, thanks staff for bringing this forward. I think this is this method allows us the tools, gives us the tools to propagate from year to year without having our lack of control over non-market change impact our mill rates. So in this way, we can clearly see the impact of non-market change, and at that third stage of council deliberation as to whether or not we are okay with how it's propagated from year to year, then we can consider if we want to change the tax distribution. But having the default year-to-year propagation based on what happens before market change, before non-market change, I believe gives us more access and more understanding. Thanks.
Thank you. Other comments? Go ahead, Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, I'm not inclined to support this at this time. For me, the ratio method makes sense that, for philosophical reasons, we've decided that one class should pay more than another. We just then figure out how much we need and we split it up, non-market or not, based on those ratios and the assessments. To me, that makes intuitive sense. It's not clear enough to me yet of why this non-market piece needs to be kept in or outside of a class, or why one is better than the other. So I'm having trouble wrapping my head around what is the benefit we're achieving, and I haven't heard that articulated. We've talked a bit about the differences between the two, but it's not clear to me why one's better than the other. For me, it's clear that what we're doing makes sense. Having said that, I understand this will come back to us, and so maybe I can try and have some good questions before then, and maybe I will come to agreement when this comes back to us. But at this point, it's just not clear that we're getting a big benefit from this change. Like, I'm not clear what the benefit is here. So yeah, that's where I am right now. Thanks.
Thank you. Other comments? Go ahead, Councillor Stoner.
Yeah, thank you. Through the chair, I will support the motion on the floor. Appreciate the work that staff have done to date, and the fact that this is a fairly nerdy, nuanced conversation. I keep on thinking of how the Squamish chief is going to report out on this in any fulsome way, other than reading the very well-detailed staff report, because I think that does make sense in my brain when I read through the details. So thank you for making tax ratios and tax burdens and the revenue distribution model make sense. To me, I think as I dug into the details and appreciate Councillor Pettingill's concern here, I think both of the methodologies do account for our existing policies that are in place around fair, equitable distribution of tax and the clarity or the consistency year over year. To me, this is really about fairly attributing tax burden to non-market change or new folks who come into the portfolio. So there's different ways where you get non-market change. The most likely is that you have new folios within a tax class. And so if there are more people in that tax class or more folios, they should be handling more of the tax burden over time, as opposed to distributing that tax burden over to existing taxpayers. And so that's the piece to me that is driving my support for this. I don't think, and given the examples that staff have provided, I don't think it's going to be a tectonic shift in the way that we generate tax revenue distribution in this coming year. And I think it'll be a good starting point for establishing an updated tax policy because our current one is a little bit outdated. So I look forward to that future conversation, and thanks to staff and council for having this conversation today.
Thank you. Other comments? Go ahead, Councillor French.
Thanks, Mayor. I'll be supporting the motion, and in speaking to it, echo some of the comments of Councillor Stoner. This is fairly complex stuff that most residents and citizens would have troubles wrapping their heads around, including me. This is some pretty complex math here. But thanks to the good work of staff, it's been laid out logically and in a way that even a math challenged individual like I can figure out the subtle differences and come to a conclusion, and in this case, supporting the revenue distribution method. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Anderson.
Thank you. Yes, I'll also be supporting the motion. I think that the revenue distribution method satisfies the ratepayers' interest in certainty, equity, and fairness. I do recall when, and I'm not sure that I was on council, it must have been a few years prior, that when the principles of maintaining competitive rates for Class 5 light industry and maintaining a Class 6 business multiplier that encourages new business investment in the district, to quote from the staff report. I remember the council's conversation on that. I supported it at the time. And I think that as per the staff report, council still may use their authority to shift the revenue distribution toward or away from one class or another by revising or setting new tax distribution percentages. So we retain the tools that we would be interested to retain, and I think that we do achieve some better equity, fairness, and certainty with the revenue distribution model. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments? Speaking in support of the motion, I think given the main difference here is really about the non-market change and how it's accounted for in our processes. I think that when I think about all of our projections around growth in our community, that it's appropriate that we adopt some policy that really takes this into full consideration. I could see some other market conditions like ones without non-market change where we wouldn't be having a conversation about it. So I do think it's totally appropriate at this point in time to be moving in this direction to make sure that the outcomes here are intentional over time with non-market change incorporated into them. So I'm happy to support and look forward to seeing that come forward. With that, I'll call the question. All in favor and oppose? Councillor Pettingill opposes. Motion carries. Thank you. Yep, go ahead.
I'd like to move the third point, receive the information. Oh,
Let's just do
yeah, okay.
Yeah, thank you for yeah, but let's move on to the second part of this, and then we'll do the 3 and 4 together.
As outlined in the report to council, included in the 2025 preliminary tax assessment roll is 11.8 million resulting from reclass of WLNG properties to major industry. The WLNG folios or properties are the only properties contained in the major, contained in the major Class 4 major industry. Based on 2024 major industry approved rate of 125, this represents tax revenues of approximately 1.5 million in 2025. It is best practice to avoid creating a tax-based dependency for ongoing operations on one business, as it poses increased risk of large tax fluctuations or drainage of reserves should that business cease operations. Examples of the impact of this industrial tax-based dependency has occurred in many communities across BC with the shutdown of pulp and paper or lumber mills, which result in communities having to absorb the loss of their tax base to maintain basic municipal services. To ensure that the district doesn't create a tax-based dependency on WLNG for annual municipal operations services, it is recommended that the revenue from WLNG be held in a reserve and utilized to fund one-time temporary costs such as capital projects, temporary operational costs, or offsetting debt. In order to do so for the 2025 fiscal, an amendment for the 2025 to 29 financial plan is required to increase the tax revenue received from Class 4 major industry and transfer the revenue to reserve. During the 2024 to 28 financial plan cycle, and again in the 2025 to 29 financial plan, Council endorsed adding 4 additional RCMP members to address community safety needs associated with the construction phase of the WLNG and Fortis Eagle Mountain pipeline project, to be funded by the additional taxation revenue received from WLNG Class 4 major industry. The 4 members cost approximately $400,000 in 2024 and were funded by protective services provision with the intent of replenishing the provision in 2025. The 2025 budgeted amounts of these 4 RCMP members is approximately $1.05 million. Therefore, the 2025 Class 4 major industry tax revenue is sufficient to cover the 2024 protective services provision loan and the additional RCMP members for 2025. So with that, I will hand it over to Council.
Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Stoner.
Thank you, through the chair. My first question is, with the proposal to allocate the money in 2025 back to the protective services provision, the intent isn't to have those RCMP members on for a short period of time. They extend into our financial plan. And so following the best practice of not using one-time revenues for operating, what is our intended plan for smoothing in that transition for those 4 members into our tax burden?
Thank you for the question through the mayor. So as part of the 24 to 28 financial plan, as well as the 25 to 29 financial plan, it was intended to be temporarily funding those operations and smoothing in utilizing the WLNG taxation in year 28 to 29 to keep those members at that time. That was based on projections in 2024 on what the need of the community will be once the construction phase is over for the WLNG project.
Thank you for reminding me of that. And then my second question was just if this is approved by council and we do decide to set aside this into a reserve, does that come with its own reserve policy in terms of how that money might be spent?
Thank you. Through the chair, yes, best practice would be that we would establish a reserve, establish a bylaw with its own reserve policy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor French.
Thank you. I want to be sure that I'm clear about how the taxation works in the major industry category. So tax class 4 is the major industry category. And then in brackets, we've got the words port and port improvements. And the port category is 27.5%. Port improvements is 22.5%. And in the report to council, there's also an indication of a rate of 125 for major industry that is not a port operation. So out of all that, is it correct to say that the major industry category currently actually has 3 different rates, the 125, 27.5, and 22.5?
Thank you for the question through the chair. The port is governed by an act that was established, I can't remember the date, but somewhere in the 90s, that capped major industry, so folios major industry that had the description of port. So they are considered sort of a subclass of major industry and would be unaffected by the 125.
So in previous years, the only property assessed at the 27.5 and the 22.5% rates in the major industry category is the land where Squamish Terminals is located. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so then we're now seeing, I believe, a portion of the wood fiber lands move into major industry. That being the case, what tax category was the wood fiber land taxed under previously? Was it light industry? Is that where it fell?
Thank you through the chair. It was in various, so there was some in residential, there was some in light industry, there was some in business. There was various folios, and you can have one folio be assessed in 2 different classes or more.
Okay. So with that small number of properties being taxed as major industry, got me wondering, are log sorts that are zoned I-5, plus places like the Squamish Valley Road Sawmill, which is zoned resource, and properties that are zoned I-3 in the business park, have they been and do they continue to be taxed as light industry?
Thank you for the question through the chair. As far as we understand it, everything that would be in light industry would stay in light industry. The only elements so far affected by major industry is, and who have met the definition of major industry, are the WLNG plant.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Mayor.
And that definition comes from BC assessment, not from anything that happens in this building. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it is quite a complicated model as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, I think thanks to Councillor Stoner and French, who asked most of my questions, but I just want to drill down on Councillor Stoner. So if I understand correctly, what I think the response was, we are consistent with our policy, effectively using the taxation from wood fiber, the property tax, to fund the 4 members, but recognizing that after construction, we will need those members for general community protection, and therefore it's an operational expense. We are phasing in funding them from operational, and the taxation that will have been funding them for the first 4 years or so, that will then start going into capital reserves at the end of 4 years. Is that correct?
Through the chair, that is correct.
Thank you for the Coles turning into Coles notes for us, sir. Councillor Pettingill, you're good. Okay, so we have a recommendation before us. I think I got through everyone on the list. So I will move this point and the receive point that was left over from the last one. So item 3 and this one together, if there's a seconder. Councillor French, thank you. Just thank you for bringing this forward. And I'm happy to see that this is also aligning with some plans and some aspirations we had for how this could this matter could be addressed. So thank you for identifying that in advance, and I'm happy to be at this point of executing this. So thank you very much, and thank you to my council colleagues for supporting. Councillor French.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. And just briefly, in speaking in support of this directive, if the amount coming continues or is unpredictable in the future, the ideal solution in my mind is to feed it into reserve. So I just feel that this is in the best interest of our community and also addresses our immediate policing needs.
Thank you. Councillor Stoner.
Yeah, thank you. Through the chair. I don't know if exciting is the right word, but I do think it's good that we are finally seeing some level of benefit from this project entering into our community. I think it has been a long time coming and a lot of expectation from our community that wood fiber was going to generate some sort of revenue that we could at least see some benefit from. And so I think our community will be really excited to see that this is the first $1.5 million that is legitimately coming from taxation from this project into our budget. I do want to address, I think, probably a lot of questions that will be forthcoming in terms of how do we not generate this revenue earlier, more often, in order to build a new pool or build a new ice rink. And I just want the community to know that we are working on it. This is the first bit of being able to tax this project in a reliable and consistent and fair way. Now that they have been appropriately reclassed by BC assessment into the major industry component, and we are taxing them at a very high ratio of 125, which I believe is one of the highest in the province, and that's what's generating the $1.5 million this year. And it is being used in order to phase in some much needed support for our CMP members in our community, both to address the immediate needs that this project is likely going to develop and put strain on our CMP members, as well as to increase the amount of our CMP force in our community in order to address our growing population more broadly. So I think that this is a reasonable approach, and I think going forward, bringing forward a reserve policy to make sure that this money is capital going forward is also makes good sense. So I look forward to that future discussion around setting a policy around a reserve for this taxation money. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Pettingill, then Anderson.
Yeah, just a couple of points into maybe just almost reiterate some of my colleagues. I think where we started is several years ago, Wood Fiber offered $2 million a year in taxation for the life of the project, I think. And I think there's a renewal on that. And so we're at 1.5 million very early days. And at least that was my understanding from what I read publicized. But we are now in early days and we're at 1.5. So we have a fair mechanism to tax this and see the taxation that we should. I think we are trying to be prudent and we will go from there.
Thank you. Councillor Anderson.
Yes, I'm also in support of this recommendation. I just wanted to throw out a footnote that we should be mindful of ongoing of the implications for other existing and potential major industry participants in our community. With respect to the Port Property Tax Act introduced in 2004, we have been lobbied by the City of Prince Rupert to join them in advocating for the repeal of this act. And in fact, that council, not this one or the last one, but the one prior to that, expressed some sympathy to the City of Prince Rupert and did go some ways toward encouraging the province to give consideration to this. So it's not secure what may evolve with the Ports Property Tax Act. We can't be sure of that. So I just suggest that we should continue to be mindful of the impacts on existing and potential future major industrial projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep. Go ahead, Councillor Greenlaw.
Yeah, just speaking in support of the motion and echoing some of the comments that have already been made. It'll be nice to finally see some benefit of this project coming to our community, and lots of conversations around needed amenity improvements for our community that we hear about on a daily basis. So it'll be nice to see this money put towards going back to the people. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other comments, I'll call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to put forward an additional motion to ask staff to make the non-market change numbers part of the default package that council receives when we consider the mill rates each year by class.
Seconded by Councillor Stoner. Okay. Any other comments on this? I think we went into this in detail in the first portion of our discussions today. So I'll call the question then. All in favor? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much for that. And now I'm looking for a motion to, yes, Councillor Stoner.
I'd like to move termination.
Okay, I'll second that. Thank you. All in favor? Motion carries. Thank you very much. But don't go too far, Council. We'll be back at 6 o'clock. Thank you.